Madden. I'm the field crop specialist at Perennia.
And today we are standing in a fall rye seeding rate by seeding date demonstration that we put together. So we seeded every week
from late September, September 27th was the first, right until mid-November.
So it was an exceptionally beautiful fall here in the Annapolis Valley. Just gorgeous right through mid-November. So even though these were later dates than we would typically recommend for a fall rye planting, usually we say try not to go past Halloween, we actually had really good establishments, and that's something to keep in mind as our climate changes, is that dates that you typically would expect to be a cutoff date might become your new normal going forward.
Yeah, so this would be a really applicable thing if you're going in after corn silage or soybeans, something like that, and want to put a cover crop in. Fall rye is going to be able to establish in the cooler soils, and this is just about kind of how far can we push it into the fall, and what effect does seeding rate have as we move further into the fall as well.
So some of the common wisdom that you might hear is that if you're going to be pushing your seeding dates later into the fall, maybe it's necessary to bump up your seeding rate a little bit. And so it kind of depends on what your goals are with your cover crop. Even a very scarce population is going to stop some of that overland flow. It's going to prevent some of that erosion. And maybe even if you don't have good soil cover in the fall, it's going to green up in the spring and protect your soil until you can come in with your cash crop in the spring, say end of May maybe.
Yeah. And another benefit for the spring is it's going to compete with some of those early emerging weeds, which is always a nice little bonus.
That's true. So fall rye has allelopathic properties in its roots, which means that it exudes something that the weeds don't like, so you'll have a cleaner field that you're planting into.
So the seeding rates that we did at each of the seeding dates, we did 50 pounds to the acre, 100 pounds, 150 pounds, and 200 pounds. So it's really interesting. We'll get into that a little bit more, but looking at earlier dates, and we don't see a huge difference visually between the two seeding rates when we are looking at it from this end of April.
So you could notice differences in canopy cover in the fall with some of those heavier rates, but right now looking at the 50 pounds and the 200 pound rates in those September seeding dates even through to mid-October, it's looking pretty similar.
Yeah, you'd have a hard time picking it out unless you were getting right in there. But when we get into the later dates, both in the fall and now in the spring, there is quite a noticeable difference between those seeding rows.
So let's take a closer look.
So this is the September 27th seeding date, and this was 200 pounds of fall rye per acre. And I'm just looking at the tillering here, and you can see most of these plants really only have one main stem on them, so they really didn't do any fall tillering. Because of the high density of seeding rate. Right, this was the September 27th seeding date, and the rate was 50 pounds per acre. And you'll see in comparison to the higher seeding rate, there's more tillers on these plants. So there's 3 tillers here, and we've got, the main stem plus 3. On this one. So these ones would have had a lot more space in between the plants in the fall, so they were able to tiller out more and to really fill in that space. So this was the October 14th seeding date, 200 pounds per acre, and it's really looking quite similar to the September 27th date. Most of these plants just have one main stem and maybe one tiller off of them. Good amount of root mass, So really, this was quite a successful planting date. We did have a beautiful fall and a very warm, long fall in 2022. So even though these were planted mid-October, they still had a good amount of time to really take off before winter set in. So this is the October 14th seeding date, and we're in the 50 pounds per acre rate. And in comparison to the 200, again, we're seeing a lot more tillers. This has a main stem and 2 to 3 really nice tillers on this plant.
And some nice root balls. So this is going to provide some good soil stabilization from some of those winter rains. We're having more open winters and wetter winters with climate change here in Nova Scotia. So this is going to keep your soil in place. This is a really sandy soil, but you can see signs of microbial life. You see how some of these roots are coated. It looks kind of like a dreadlock. That's those root exudates feeding that microbial life, and that's where you get a lot of your more stable carbon sequestration.
So this is the October 28th planting date. Over where the shovel is, that's your 50 pounds per acre, followed by 100, 150, and then 200 where the blue hat is.
And so you can see that the 200 has filled in a bit more than the 50 pound rate, but they still all providing pretty good soil cover on April 18th. So this is the 50 pounds per acre that was seeded on October 28th. This is the 100 pounds per acre seeded on October 28th. This is 150 pounds per acre seeded on October 28th. This is the 200 pounds per acre seeded on October 28th.
On April 26th, we measured the average amount of ground cover using an app called Canopeo. So you can see on this graph that as we get into the later planting dates, the overall ground coverage does decrease, which is what we would expect to see. At the first 3 planting dates, really, all of the seeding rates are fairly similar in terms of ground cover at that April 26th date that we measured at. Once we get to October 21st, things start to drop off a little bit more, and we start to see some differences, some more significant differences between the seeding rates. So at October 21st, the 200 and the 150 seeding rate had less ground coverage than the 50 and the 100. And that's likely because the 50 and the 100 had time to do some spring tillering, and that kind of filled things in and upped the ground coverage a little bit. We see that in the October 28th as well. The 200 is lower. The 50 is also lower at that October 28th seeding date, and that's probably because it was sparser going into the winter. So even if it did do some tillering in the spring, it was still sparse and it wasn't enough to really measure up and fill in as much as the other seeding rates. There's not as much ground coverage at the November dates, so it runs between about 8 and 17% coverage. Although that is still going to provide a little bit of benefit, especially from some wind erosion, or if you get a heavy rain early in the spring, there's still a little bit of biomass there to be able to slow down those raindrops or slow down that wind and provide a little bit of protection for your soil.
So this is fall rye that was seeded late September at 2 different seeding rates. We have the 200 pounds per acre here and 50 pounds per acre here. So important to note that this is a super dry soil, and there was no residual fertility, so we did have reduced tillering. At that 200 pounds rate, you've got 2 tillers, 1 tiller, 1 till, not a lot going on there, but at your lower rate you did have some tillering that kind of made up for that lower seeding rate. But when you look at those plants, they're pretty similar in size, and when you look at the plots, pretty similar ground cover actually. It's May 19th now, so we're well into stem elongation. Ideally this would have been terminated a week or two ago before it got super carbony.
So over here to my left, we have the 200 pounds per acre. This is the 150, 100 pounds per acre, and over where Rosie is the 50 pounds per acre. And you can see there's pretty similar ground cover between them, and the plants are relatively similar size. So at that early planting date, things kind of all evened out in the wash.
Yeah, the tillering from that lower planting date sort of filled in.
Yeah, made up for the lack of seed.
So I would still say that 50 pounds is a little risky. I would prefer to see closer to 100, maybe even 125, regardless of your planting date. But if you're running low on seed, or if you're pinching pennies, even 50 pounds an acre on a late September planting date, this is September 27th,
Yeah, September 27th.
you can still get away with it.
Alright, so here we have our October 28th planting, 200 pounds to the acre and 50 pounds to the acre. Again, the plants are a very similar size, but on the 200 pounds to the acre you have a fairly good root structure here. There's quite a bit to it. One thing I want to mention is that, especially when we're getting late into the season, it worked out here on this soil because it's a very dry soil. But if you're in a heavier soil, then you might get into issues with the seed rotting before it actually emerges and takes off. So really dependent on what kind of conditions you're going into.
So here again, there is a little bit more tillering on that lower seeding rate, but not nearly as much as those earlier planting dates. Why is that, Caitlin?
So as we get later in the season, we've got less less growing degree units. So you're not going to get to the stage where there's a lot of tillering when you get that late in the fall.
And you can see with this, as Caitlin mentioned, the root ball on that October 28th date, those roots really went down a lot deeper to access some of those deeper nutrients because there was so much competition at the soil surface, which is kind of nice to see. It really did a nice job of stabilizing the soil over the winter. So, as you get later into the season, you might have similar, you might want to try and up your seeding rate to get more ground cover.
Yeah, and so more stems with that higher seeding rate where you're not going to get the tillering that late in the season.
Yeah.
Okay, so again, this is our October 28th, the 200 over there where Rosie is, and the 50 pounds to the acre here where I am. And what I want to say about this is that based on the conditions that we had last fall for growing, and kind of how things played out this spring, this is kind of the last point that I was happy with what we got, based on my goals for this particular piece, which was looking at some of the ground cover and getting some of that good root mass. As we get into the later plantings, which are both in November, things really drop off quite a bit.
How late you want to push it depends on what kind of fall you're having.
Yeah.
Last fall was super warm, well into November, and so, it's not wildly impressive, those November planting dates, but they did something. But it was an unusually warm November.
Yeah, and I think the key is that if you're pushing into that later part of the fall, then you just want to temper your expectations as to what's going to occur and what you're going to get out of your cover crop.
And so that cover crop still soaked up some of that residual nitrogen, which is awesome. It stops it from becoming a greenhouse gas or leaching down to the soil profile. Definitely not nearly as much soil cover, definitely not nearly as much carbon, but it was still living roots in the soil for a couple of months that wouldn't otherwise have been there.
All
right, so this was our latest planting last fall. It was done on November 9th. We've got our 200 pounds to the acre and our 50. These plants are definitely a lot shorter than the other planting dates, and really no tillering to speak of whatsoever. There is some, there's a little bit of root growth there, and that's going to do something to hold a little bit of soil in place, especially on these really light soils. Got some pretty good, decent, root exudates building up there. So even though we don't have a huge amount of root mass here, they are still living roots in the soil and planted quite late in the season, and have been able to provide something over the spring in terms of soaking up any residual nutrients that might be there and contributing back into your soil health. On May 24th, we took biomass samples from each of the strips and sent those off for analysis. And the analysis came back telling us the amount of nitrogen and carbon in each of those samples. So looking at this nitrogen graph first, you can see that at the September 27th date, there was between 7 and 10 pounds of nitrogen per acre in each of those strips. And when we think about it, where did that nitrogen come from? It was probably mopping some up from the soil that was left from the previous crop. The previous crop in this case was a winter wheat that was not fertilized heavily. It was a fairly moderately fertilized crop, so it would have used most of what it was given. But the fall rye cover crop was still able to pull up a little bit of that nitrogen and save it from being leached away and lost. When we look at pounds of carbon per acre in each of the strips, it does follow a similar pattern as we saw in the nitrogen per acre or the ground coverage, in that it does drop off significantly as we look at the later planting dates. So we're looking at, from the earlier planting dates, anywhere from 140 to 250 pounds of carbon per acre. Once we get down to the October 14th, 21st, we're sitting around that 150 mark. And then the October 28th, November 3rd, and November 9th, some of those seeding rates are hitting 50 pounds of carbon per acre, which may not seem like a lot, but when you think about, this is a 6 or 7 month period that the ground would have otherwise been bare, then all of that is a net gain back into the system.
So I think, with this cover crop, seeding rate by seeding date has shown some really interesting results.
Yeah.
And really it depends on what you are trying to do. Having living roots in that soil does feed the soil microbial life. It builds carbon, it holds the soil in place, prevents erosion, sucks up fertility. So a cover crop, even if you think you're pushing your dates, might still be worth it if you think the ground is not going to be too cold and wet to inhibit germination. So those later planting dates, maybe a higher seeding rate might be good because maybe 20% of your seed is going to rot out.
Right. Yep.
But
you're still getting some benefit out of these really late planted cover crops. And again, just going back to what we were saying before about depends on what your goals were for the cover crop, and tempering your expectations based on the conditions and the weather that you get through the fall and into the spring.
Yeah, and as our climate changes, those later planting dates I think are going to become more and more common for a successful cover crop. So just keeping an eye on how those seasons are changing
Yeah, and particularly in your area. So, I mean, we're in the Annapolis Valley. We tend to be able to extend things into the fall a little later than most other areas of the province. So, just knowing what you kind of usually have for weather through the fall and what you might be able to get away with.